Welcome everyone from my side as well. This is a webinar on deployment with PhpStorm. Now, one of the things you typically face during deployment is how do I get my files, how do I get my code, my resources, my CSS, my JavaScript, and so on the server, and how do I make sure that all the changes I have locally are also available on a remote server. But that's only one part of deployment, as we will see in a minute. Actually, deployment is a much broader topic, and today I hope to guide you through some of the basics in PhpStorm, as well as some of the more advanced scenarios regarding deployment. So the agenda for today is basically what I just said. We will start with defining what is a deployment. Then we'll have a look at how we can do deployments from PhpStorm. There's a lot of questions and a lot of information available on mappings, and I'm going to try and make it as easy as possible to understand what mappings are in PhpStorm between your project and the remote server. We'll also have a look at synchronizing files between the local project and the server, as well as automatic uploads, which is pretty useful. And then we'll end with some deployments using Phing, which is one of the open source tools you can find to also do deployments, and also within PhpStorm. So if we look at Wikipedia and we search for software deployments, we will find this definition. So software deployment is all of the activities that make a software system available for use. Now, I don't know about you, but I think this definition is pretty vague, and a lot of people, and that includes me, are basically confused on what is deployment. And I think every one of us is right about what he or she thinks is software deployment. So software deployment can be loading files from the local project onto a remote server. It can be spinning up an EC2 machine. It can be uploading data to a database, and so on. So there's a lot of activities there that can be part of a deployment. But for PhpStorm, as we will see, the deployment in there is basically getting files from the local project onto a server somewhere. So in PhpStorm, how you typically develop, and this is only some of the ways you can develop on PhpStorm, but typically you will end up working on some of these three manners. So typically what you will have is either a web server on your local computer, and then the project also on the local computer in the document root. So basically that means that you are working in a PhpStorm project which is located in the document root of your server. So every change you make in PhpStorm is actually immediately available on the server because you're sort of working on the server. Another approach to working with PhpStorm is that you have a web server on the local computer, but your project is not in the document root. It's basically somewhere else on your computer, for example in your home folder, while the web server may be on another folder on your system. So there has to be a way of getting your project to that local folder in which the server has its document root. So that's another way of working. And then of course there's also the way of working with a web server on a remote computer, which can be a development server, which can be an EC2 instance somewhere, but this can also be a Vagrant box, for example. And what will happen there is that you typically develop locally on your computer, and that whenever you want to test or run your application code, you should somehow get your code and your application to that remote computer, whether it's actually a VM on your local machine or a real remote computer, it's a remote. So PhpStorm will treat all of these options as two different things. So in every of these situations, you have two things going on. Basically, you have a deployment server, which will run your application once you want to run it there, and you have a local project in PhpStorm. And the definition of deployment for PhpStorm is basically copying files between both of these locations in several manners, as we will see during the webinar. So in PhpStorm, if you go and configure a deployment server, and we will do that in a second, you will see that the server type can be one of several options. So you can, of course, do FTP, you can do FTPS, or SFTP to basically connect to the remote computer and get the files transferred from your project to the remote server, or from the remote deployment server to your local project. Then you have these two special cases where you're actually working on the local machine and the server is on the local machine. So what you can also say is that the server is living in a local or mounted folder. So it can be a really local folder on your machine or something that is mounted on your local machine. And you can have an in-place server, which is the case where you actually are developing right within the document root. So where PhpStorm project is actually the document root of the web server. Important thing to note is whenever you configure a deployment server in PhpStorm, that configuration is always at the IDE level. You will see that the configuration options are under project settings, but actually if you add a deployment server making use of FTP or local or mounted folder or whatever, it's actually defined at the IDE level. The only thing that is local to the project is how the project maps to the folder structure on the remote server. So that's the thing that's per project. The reason for doing this is that, for example, if you're doing WordPress development, and imagine that you are working on 2 or 3 plugins, well, every plugin can be a PhpStorm project, but perhaps they all have to be deployed to the exact same development server or to the exact same Vagrant box. And by sharing that configuration, you can actually make use of that one configuration for all these different projects, but just change how the file system looks and how the project maps to that file system on the remote server. So let's have a look at some basic configuration options and see how we can develop or deploy our application. So as you may see from the font here on Windows, I'm working with PhpStorm 8, the early access preview, which may mean that somewhere during the webinar I may have to restart the IDE. Maybe not, let's hope not. But just a quick warning, this is alpha software still. Okay, let's go for deployment. The first thing we have to do is open our settings. We can do this in several ways, go through the project settings, but we can also make use of the tools, deployment, and then configuration option. And this will basically do the exact same thing as going through the settings, going to the project settings and finding the deployment node under there. So here's the deployment node, and I can add some servers in there. So let's do that. Let's add a server, and we can give it a name. I have a very nice demo application here, which is a URL shortener, and I will show you the application during the webinar. So let's call this one shortener. Remote server, just to give it a name, basically. As I said before, you can choose the type. So in this case, it's an FTP server, so I'll go with FTP. But do know there's the other options as well to transfer your files between the project and the remote host. So let's go with OK. And then we can specify several options. Of course, the FTP host is pretty important. PhpStorm has to know where to connect. And I'm going to simply paste the server name there. That should not be this. There we go. I also require a username, which in this case is JetBrains. And I will also require a password. Now, if you're not sure, you can always use the test FTP connection and see if you actually filled out all these details correctly. And it looks like I've done that. This is pretty basic. I just entered a host, optionally a port, and a username password. But if for some reason you require some advanced FTP options or SFTP or one of the other options you can select as a server type, you can do so here. So for example, if you're behind a firewall or the firewall on your server requires passive FTP transfer, you can enable that here. If you have to limit the concurrent number of connections because of firewall reasons or because of server reasons, you can also do that here. And same thing with encoding and so on. So let's not do that in this case. Now, I already told you about mappings. So basically what I've just done is configure the remote host, but PhpStorm doesn't yet know where if I were to upload the files from my project, it doesn't really know where they should end up on the file system and which URL in a browser may map to that virtual or remote file system. So in this case, I'm going to provide the web server root, which is going to be jetbrains-shortener.azurewebsites.net, and you can browse there, but you will see that the application is not live yet because we will do that during the webinar. But during the webinar, whenever I upload it, you can try the application on this URL for yourself. Okay, another thing I have is this mappings tab, and I will go into mappings later on, But it's important that PhpStorm knows that the local project path, in this case shortener, maps to a path on the server, and I can select which path, and that's going to be site and then my document root. And that path on the web server, as the URL, is basically just at the root of the web server. So basically, by specifying this, PhpStorm knows that this URL maps to this path in my project. It knows that if I'm browsing the remote host on this path, it also knows that it maps to this path in my local project. So we have to specify how the file systems map to one another. Okay, let's go with OK. And from now on, we can start browsing our remote host and uploading and so on. So if we go again to the Tools menu, go to Deployment, and then say we want to browse the remote hosts, we can connect to the remote host, and as you can see, we can browse our application root and so on. By the way, you see this green background here in the remote host tab. That is basically because I configured this mapping, and this www root maps to my local project folder. So PhpStorm, by making this background green, lets you know that it knows that this folder maps to a folder in the local project. Okay, now let's upload some files, and how we can do that, it's basically pretty simple. What we can do is simply drag and drop. So if we hold the Control key and drag our application, drag our web config file, for example, to the remote host. And this doesn't seem to work currently, which is pretty strange. There we go. So we can upload this web config, and yeah, it will happen like that. So we can simply drag and drop to the remote server. There we go. Another file goes to the server. And we can also see this nice transfer log at the bottom. So every action that is happening and everything that requires a file transfer to the remote server will be shown in here. And you will see whatever is happening, 1 file, 2 files. If something goes wrong, you will also see those things in there. Now, of course, dragging and dropping every individual file is a little bit crazy. So I'm going to simply remove these 2 files here. And instead, I'm going to right-click my project and use the context menu there, go to the deployment context menu and say upload to the remote server. And this will basically trigger an upload of all the files that I have. Now, I've been dragging and dropping, but do know that you can also just copy. So I did a copy there, and I can paste it on the remote as well. And this will also perform a transfer from the local project to the remote server. Also in the remote direction, so if you have a file on the remote server and you want to copy to the local project, you can also do that by simply copying and pasting, or using the context menu and saying that you want to download from here to the local project. So it's pretty easy to do, actually. Now it looks like my internet connection is pretty slow at the moment, but that's probably because I'm doing a webinar. But the upload is still running, and we should be able to see the files we are uploading in a little bit. But let's just let the application run, let's PhpStorm run, and return back to the slides for a minute. So these mappings, I already touched the word mapping, but it's a really important concept if you're doing deployments with PhpStorm. Basically, the IDE needs to know what is the PhpStorm project path, how does that map to the document root on the remote server, and how does that map to the root URL. So in my example here, I have my PhpStorm project on shortener, on my local projects, on my C drive, which maps to my document root, which maps to a URL, which is the root of my web application. By default, you will typically need just one mapping. But there are several situations where you might want to add multiple mappings. And one of these situations is actually a pretty common one that you see with Zen Framework, you see it with Laravel, you see it with Symfony, which is this one. Typically, those frameworks, or maybe your custom framework, works like this. You have a public folder which contains all the HTML, the CSS, the JavaScript, and your index.php, your htaccess file, and so on. Basically, all the files that have to be public in the document root of the remote server. Then what typically happens is that the actual application, which can be an MVC application, but in my example, for example, it's just a number of application files, those live in a folder which is not inside the document root on the server, which also means that if you have someone trying out all the different URLs that they can do on my website, they can never actually go to this application folder because it's not in the web server document root. So how does that work in PhpStorm? Well, it's the same thing as we did earlier. You have to have a mapping of those paths. So in this case, you would add a second mapping. And how that mapping would work is that you map the application folder to the remote path where you want this application folder to live, and you leave the web path blank, which basically also tells PhpStorm that this specific path is not reachable through a web browser somewhere. Then we can also add a public folder, which maps to the actual document root and which still maps to my root URL of the website as well. So let's see how we can do this in PhpStorm. I'm going to switch back to my project here. And as we can see, the upload actually succeeded, and we can now browse the remote host as well. Okay, let's go with the advanced mappings first. So if we return to the settings and to the mappings folder, or sorry, the mappings tab for our current remote server, we can say we want to add another mapping. So let's do that, and let's change these things a bit. So what I'm going to do is say that my public folder in my project maps to my document root, which also maps to the root URL of my web server. And I'm also going to say that my, and I have to copy the exact path, of course. I'm also going to say that my application folder maps to /site/application. By the way, I'm typing this, but there's also these little dots that you can use to browse the remote server and select where you want to store this in case you have a really large or very complicated file system on the remote. And what I'm going to do, the web path for this mapping is going to stay blank. Reason for that is this folder is not reachable through a browser or through the document root, so I can simply leave it blank. You will see PhpStorm give you a warning about this fact, but that's just a warning. It's not an error. You can simply continue. The reason why PhpStorm is doing this is because maybe you are mapping the public folder, and if you forget it in that situation, you want to be notified about this, and you want to make sure that you enter all those details. So let's go with OK, and let's see how this changes things. So first of all, what I'm going to do on the remote server is do a little housekeeping. I'm going to move the application folder to my sites folder by simply dragging and dropping. Should probably not take too long. It's working in the background. And I'm also going to move everything from the public folder to my www root folder. Reason for that is the public folder should no longer exist. It should all be in the document root. And it seems while doing a webinar, my upload is really, really slow. So let's give it a couple of seconds. And in the meanwhile, I will entertain you with a very, very nice little function that exists. So imagine you have this document root, and you are browsing this from this remote host pane, and you want to navigate to the document root in your local project. How would you do this? Well, you can simply use a shortcut for that, and then select where you want to open this folder in the local project. So let's say project view, and I will end up in my public folder. And my move apparently failed, so I'm going to wait a little bit longer and maybe just recommence the actual upload. Seems my connection was really, really bad here. And I even think I killed my FTP server, which is an awesome thing to do. There goes my demo. What I'm going to do now is typically something you would not have to do, but it seems that my FTP server is gone. So I'm going to try and restart my IDE. Let's see if that helps. And if it doesn't, I'm going to restart my FTP server anyway. So let's launch PhpStorm again. Should be there. in a few seconds. There we are. And let's hope our remote host works again. No authentication data provided. That's actually a very good thing, which means I can log in again and hopefully also see the remote file system. Yes, there we are. So apparently nothing happened, so I'm just going to remove all the files and make sure that we are ready for the next demos that will come. So I'm now deleting all the files. And I'm just going to wait for it, not overload my connection to make sure the failure of a few moments ago doesn't happen again. So what I was saying is that you can also switch to from the remote project to the remote server as well. So imagine you are in the public folder here and you want to go to the document root to which this folder is mapped. Well, I can simply do Alt F1 again, or a different shortcut on Mac OS X, and go to the remote host, and my www root will be selected. Same thing if I upload my application folder, for example. This will actually navigate back and forth between my local folder in my project and the folder on my remote server. So uploading my application folder, and we should be able to already see the application folder if everything goes well. But again, let's maybe not overload the connection here. There we are. I mentioned this green background. The fact that we now see two items with a green background means that we have two mappings that map to some folder in our local project, so we can see those in here as well. So my application folder is uploading. I'm going to try and add my public folder to that as well. So we have our application running in a few seconds. And I'm going to show you another configuration option that may be useful. So far, if we go back to the settings, we have seen the connection tab where we can configure the connection to connect to the remote server. We've seen the mappings where we can map our local paths to a remote paths on the server and to the web URL that we have somewhere. And there's a third tab, which is the excluded paths. Imagine, I've seen people do this, put some documentation or some markdowns or whatever into a documentation folder in the project, but perhaps this documentation folder is something you don't really want to upload to the remote server. Well, what you can do is simply add a local path that you want to ignore the upload for. So for example, if we select our CSS, whenever we do an upload, that CSS folder will not be synchronized or not uploaded to the remote server. So I can do that here. I can also do this with remote paths. So if I say that I'm not interested in my document roots CSS folder, I can also ignore that one here. So I can do it in both directions. And in the meanwhile, I see my application has been uploaded, which should also mean that you can now try my application, which lives at shortener, jetbrainshortener.azurewebsites.net. So it's the URL shortener nobody was waiting for, because it's a very long URL. But more on that one in a little bit. Okay. Another very interesting thing that we can do is synchronizing changes. So imagine we have some changes made on the remote because you're working with a team and your team members are working on the same server, or you are working through an FTP client and also doing changes on the remote server while you are developing in PhpStorm. What this thing does is it allows you to synchronize the local path or the local project with the remote server. And also gives you a way of looking at diffs and merging actually changes from the remote server to the local project. So let's see if we can do that, and let's see if we can synchronize some changes there. And for that, I'm going to return to my virtual machine and back to PhpStorm. And before I go in, I'm going to quickly make a little remote change so we can actually see this feature at work. So I'm going to log into my remote server through the browser. Shouldn't take too long. There we are. I'm going to open a console there. Let's go into my site folder. Let's go into my www root, and let's maybe make some change to the index.php. Maarten was here and here, and maybe also there. Let's save this one, and let's maybe make another change in another file in the bootstrap.js. Maarten was here. Not very, very useful, but it's just to demonstrate how this works in a minute. So imagine we are working locally and we now have some changes on the remote. How are we going to synchronize the local application with the remote server? Well, first of all, the way you should not do this is by right-clicking your project and using the Synchronize menu there. I know it's a little bit confusing, but this basically means reload all the files from disk and show them again in PhpStorm. And this has nothing to do with deployments. So if you are confused by the Synchronize menu, that's not the one to work with for deployments. The one to work with is the download from shortener remote server, for example. Or if you want to use it on one single file, what you can do is deployment and say that you want to synchronize this one with the remote server. So let's do that for just this index.php file. And as you can see, PhpStorm detected that the remote file is newer than the one we have right now. How did it compare this? Well, by content. So it checked the content of my remote file, and based on that, PhpStorm decided that the remote file was newer. If I want to do this on file size, for example, or on file size and timestamp, I can also do that. And PhpStorm in this case will give me the exact same result. Fun thing is, I can decide how I want these files to be synchronized. So if I want to ignore all the remote changes and just copy to write, so basically copy from my local project to the remote server, I can do that, and all the remote changes will simply be overwritten. But maybe you don't want to do this, and you maybe want to copy the remote file to the local server. Well, that's the way you can do it. And if you want to just add individual changes, you can also do that by, for example, using the div there and changing the local file and not running the entire synchronization. But if you want to run the synchronization, we can simply do that as well by clicking the run button there, and synchronization will happen. So it's pretty easy and pretty useful if you are working with both local changes and remote changes. And as you can see, this is my local project file now, or sorry, my local index.php. All the changes I made on the remote server are now in there, and I'm just going to remove those again. All right, awesome. There's a couple of other things that we can do. And for that, I'm going to quickly pop back to the slides. So everything we've done until now was manual. I had to manually upload files to the remote server. I had to manually trigger a synchronization and so on. So I think it would be much nicer if PhpStorm would automatically upload all my changes to the remote server. Either all the time, whenever I make a change, also make it available on the remote server, or maybe I just want this to happen whenever I start my application with a run or debug configuration, or whenever I do a VCS commit. Well, good news, we can do that. So some things we can do is enable automatic uploads. That's the easiest option. This one will basically give you the functionality where PhpStorm will automatically upload whatever file is changed in the IDE. By default, it will only watch files that you are actually editing and not things generated by file watchers or VCS branch changes and so on, but you can enable that one as well. So basically whatever you would do would be synchronized to the remote server. One little thing that you have to do there, you have to specify the default deployment server for the project you are working in. Pretty logical. PhpStorm has to know where to automatically upload to, so that's why you have to specify the default. And I'm going to show you how this works. Okay, let's maybe first remove a couple of files from my remote server, so we have some more interesting things to show. Remove some CSS files. Let's maybe also remove my index.php file. There we go. Okay, let's go back to the options, and let's open this deployment option and go to the options tab there. There's a couple of options we can specify here. One of the things we can specify is that we can say that we want to automatically upload changed files to the default server. By default, this is set to never, which means never automatically uploads. Well, if I say whenever I do a Control S, or I think it's a Command S on Mac, I'm not sure, I can also enable that one, and whenever I use that shortcut, PhpStorm will do an upload there. Or I can specify to always upload file changes, so whenever PhpStorm decides file should be saved, it will upload the file. But I'm going to go with an explicit save in this situation. So let's make a change to my index.php, and let's add a comment there, start here, and hit Control S. As you can see from the file transfer log here, we've done an upload by triggering this Control S. And also our index.php file is now on the remote server. Pretty cool, right? Let's do the same thing with a CSS file, or actually a less file. So I have a less file here, and instead of JetBrains font, let's maybe rename this one to base font or something, and I'm using multiple cursors to do that, which is in PhpStorm 8. So let's name this one base font, hit Control S. And as you can see, my .less file has been uploaded, but I also enabled a file watcher which transpiles my less file into CSS, and that one hasn't been uploaded in this case, so that's sort of annoying. Well, the reason for that is, again, PhpStorm only looks at the files you actually are editing, and not the files changed by file watchers and so on. So what I can do is go to the settings, say I want to upload external changes as well. By the way, there's some other options in there as well, but for this case, I just want to say upload external changes. And if I now make a change to my less file, and let's say, I don't know, Comic Sans is a pretty cool font face, I think. People are going to ban me for this. Control S. And as you can see, my .css file now also has been automatically uploaded, which is pretty useful, I think. Now, I'm going to skip the slides on the next one because I can simply show it in the IDE as well. But before I do that, excuse me, I'm going to disable the automatic upload because it's something else I will be showing you. So let's say I do not want to upload this one. Okay, there we are. Again, to make it a little more interesting, I'm going to remove my index.php and maybe also my bootstrap.js. There we are. Okay, I have a couple of run configurations here. I can run my application on my local web server, and I can deploy and run on production, which is pretty interesting. But before I deploy and run on production or on a Vagrant box or on my development server, I want my local files to be uploaded or deployed to this remote server. It's pretty simple to do. We can actually go to Edit Configurations, edit the actual run configuration there, and add a before launch setting. So what I can do there is add one, which is upload files to remote host. And this will give me a new window where I can select the server which I want to upload to. And I can also specify all the paths that I want to upload to the server. So I have to specify that I want to upload my public folder, and in this case also my application folder. Now the reason for this is maybe for development purposes you don't want to always upload all the files for every run configuration, and this sort of allows you to make some better decisions on which run configuration uploads which files to the remote. So let's go with OK there. And I think it hasn't saved it because my window got lost. And let's try that again. Upload to my remote server. Let's specify two paths there, where one will be my application path and the other one will be my public path. Okay, let's go with OK this case. This time, and now you can see that I'm actually uploading files to my remote server before I start this run configuration. So let's do that. Let's run this actual configuration and look at the remote transfer log here. You will see that it's actually performing an upload of all the files in my projects before my browser window is opened, and I'm actually shortening URLs. See, a number of people have been playing with the application, so that's a good thing. The interesting thing is that I do not know what those URLs point to, so I'm not going to click them during the webinar, which is probably, I don't know, maybe I'm just distrusting you, but probably it's a good idea to not click them. I've been there before. Okay, so this was an upload before a run configuration. What if, I don't know, maybe I develop locally, and the moment where I want to deploy my files from the project to the remote server is the moment when I commit changes to VCS. So basically what I want to achieve is that my latest local commit, the local commit on my machine, that is available on my development server. Well, that's pretty easy. I've made some changes here, so if I commit this thing to my Git repository, what I can do is select that I want to upload files to one of the servers that I configured, and if I want to always do this, I can simply say that I want to always use the selected server. Pretty simple. If I now commit or commit and push, this will actually trigger an upload to the remote server. So if we look at the transfer log, you will again see that a couple of files have been transferred to the remote application, to the remote server. Pretty easy. We've seen how we can automatically deploy to a remote server whenever we make a change or whenever we hit Control-S. We've seen how we can deploy to a remote application server whenever we run a run or debug configuration. Pretty interesting. And we've seen how we can deploy our application to a remote server whenever we commit to VCS. That's all pretty interesting, but let's revisit our definition of software deployment. So we started this webinar with software deployment is all of the activities that make a software system available for use. Now, in development situations where you are working in PhpStorm, typically what you will do is upload files to a development machine, work on the database server directly, run some queries there, and so on. So often you don't need anything else. But what if you are doing things like this? What if you want to label sources whenever you do a deployment? What if you want to, for example, spin up a couple of EC2 instances whenever you do a deployment or right before you do a deployment, so you actually have a server to upload to? What about database deployments? What about working with Vagrant, for example? What if deployment, in your definition, also contains smoke testing of a web application? Or, I don't know, maybe some crazy ideas. I've seen there's been this tool called the Nabas tag, which was some sort of an USB-powered rabbit, which you could lower the ears or put the ears in the air based on your build status, for example. Well, maybe you want to do that as part of the deployment. Whenever the deployment succeeds, you want to make this rabbit do something. Well, if that's your idea of a deployment, maybe you want to do that. Now, there's too many edge cases for PhpStorm to support all of that out of the box. So to do this, there's a couple of things we can do. We want to automate our deployments. That's the first thing we want to do. If there's several steps involved in deploying, the last thing you want to do is having to click a menu item and then upload the database and then click another menu item and so on. What you want to have is a script doing this deployment. For a number of reasons. We are humans, we forget things. It's pretty sunny where I live at the moment, so sun dumbens me down, which also means that whenever I do a deployment and I forget a step, my deployment is broken. And if I had automated that deployment, my deployment would not have been broken. So automate your deployments in those situations, and you can do that with, there's a number of tools available. One that I very much like is Phing, which is open source. There's also Capistrano, which is Ruby-based. I've checked on Twitter. There's a lot of PHP developers actually making use of Capistrano too, and there's a couple of others. But for this webinar, I will have a look at Phing. So Phing, if you go to phing.info, you will find that Phing is a build system, which is loosely based on Ant in the Java world and MS Build in the .NET world and so on. So basically what you will have is one giant XML file or a small XML file, depending on what your deployment looks like, which will be a project. That project will contain one or more targets, and a target is basically a grouping of several tasks, and those tasks are things that actually do something. It can be running a unit test, it can be doing some SQL statements, creating HTML-based documentation, work with source control. Whatever you want to do in there, there's a lot of tasks available on the Phing website. Now, the good thing with this thing is that using this XML file, you can basically automate your entire deployment and make it repetitive so that you can run your deployment over and over again and never have it fail because you automated it and checked for error conditions and so on. This also means that you can use it to deploy to your Vagrant box or to your development machine, but also the testers can use it to deploy it to the test server. And maybe your sysadmins can use it to deploy to production. So there's a lot of other advantages to using something like Phing or Capistrano than just the fact that you can do more than just uploading files. If you want to test Phing, you can install it through Pair, or you can just use Composer to install it as well. So some basics, and I'm actually going to do this one in PhpStorm so you can see how this actually works. And to do that, I'm going to open another project, which is my Phing sample, because I have a very, very simple Phing script in there just to show you how this works and what you can do in there. I have a hello world.xml. So this is basically a Phing file. And what this thing does is it basically describes a project. So the root element of this XML file says that this project name is my project, and the default target to execute when we run this project is world. So let's go to that world target. If we go to this world target, we see that it's, first of all, depends on hello. So this means that this world target will first run the hello target and then its own tasks. So in this case, this will simply write hello world to the console using a target per word that I want to output. So this is probably not the best example, but it's a good example to show you how this works, because you have a project with a default target and you can have dependencies between these targets. Imagine you want to have a recursive dependency and make PHP crash. You can also say that world depends on world, and then you have this crazy thing. Okay. What I can also do is PhpStorm comes with navigation and so on. So for example, if I hover over this world word here and I control click this one, I will navigate to the world target. Also, if I open the Phing tool menu, you will see my Hello World project is in there, and I can actually invoke these targets from PhpStorm. So let's do that. Let's invoke the world target. Let's run it. And you will see that in my output here, my project has a target named hello, which says hello, and world, which says world. So this is my current script. Not very useful, but again, pretty good for demo purposes. I have another example here, which is slightly more complicated, just to show you what makes Phing really, really powerful. What I'm doing here in this first target I have is sorry, I'm going to use this one. I have a target named properties, which basically gathers some arguments that will be used throughout my build script or throughout my deployment script. So for example, you see that I require a target directory somewhere, and there's also an application archive variable that I'm using somewhere to create a tar file. Well, I can do that by loading a properties file, for example, or by prompting for properties. So let's try that. And let's run this thing. And you will see that when I run this prot target, it just worked, and it knew whatever it had to do, even though I was prompting for the environment to use or which file to load. Reason for that is one of the variables that I didn't specify in here was specified in my runtime environment. So I can add some additional variables through PhpStorm as well and pass them on to my Phing script. So in this case, let's just remove those. Remove that one as well, and run it again. And you will see that now my prompt will be there, so I now have to specify that I want to use my local properties file. So what happens is I enter this local word, and this one will trigger the next thing, which loads a properties file that I have on my disk, local.properties, which is this one. And that's basically just like a simple INI file where I have a key and a value that I want to be using in my deployment script. This also means that if I want to have a local deployment, but also a remote deployment, I can simply create multiple properties files. There we go, I now have a remote properties. And if I run my build again, and I want to deploy to my remote machine, I can now simply say remote, and PhpStorm and Phing will load this other file and do the deployment with that one. So that's pretty fun to work with. Now, why am I telling you this? Because I made a very cool example, I think, and it's also on GitHub. So if you're interested in how it works, just ping me and I will send you a link to where it lives so you can actually have a look at it. So we've seen this shortener application. That application doesn't only come with PHP files, but it also comes with a database that I want to deploy whenever I deploy to my remote machine. Well, what I can do is create a Phing file which does that, deploy a database file, right? So let's maybe have a quick look at that file and see how it works. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail because we're running a little short on time, but just want you to know that this thing exists and that you can actually use it inside PhpStorm. So let's quickly switch branches to my Phing branch. Force checkout, always a good choice to lose data, by the way. So this is a different version of my application where I'm deploying the database and my application using Phing. So if we look at the Phing tool window here, you will see that there's a couple of things in there. I have targets that say I am a deployment target using FTP, a local deployment target, and an in-place deployment target. These are the ones that I want to run on either my machine or whenever I want to deploy to a remote machine. So this one basically will make sure that my configuration files are available on my local machine, and that's about it. This one will actually do an FTP upload and also upload my database to a remote server. And then my deploy local does the same thing as the deploy FTP, but just on my local machine, but on an actual server I have running here. The interesting thing is that I can create many of these targets, and I can also create many of these properties files. So for example, in this case, again, I created two properties file where I have some containing my local variables, so my local database name, my local file system details, and so on, but also the one containing my remote settings if I want to do an FTP deployment. Now, if I open my local properties, you will see there's a number of things in there. I'm specifying the path where I want to deploy. I'm specifying my application path, my public path, basically all variables that I want to make use of in my deployment scripts. Now, if we quickly go through this one, and I'm going to collapse a couple of those because they're not all that important. We will see that whenever I, for example, do a deploy in place, that deploy in place depends on gathering properties, very important to read in my local properties file, and update config, which is this target, which actually makes use of all the variables I had in my local.properties and plays them into a config.php in my application. So I look at my application, I only have a config.php.template, which contains nothing but placeholders, pretty easy. And every time I want to run this application locally, I want to run this deployment target, which updates the configuration file with the actual data. Pretty easy to do. Just like with remote hosts, I can run a Phing target whenever I deploy to my local server. So if I open this one, you will see that I'm running the deploy in place before I run my local application server. So let's do that. Let's run. You will see Phing has actually run and created my config.php, updated all the variables in there, and that I now have my application running locally by first invoking Phing on the application. So here's the local version with a database and all that. So let's shorten jetbrains.com, and as you can see, this should work. There we are. And I can now navigate forward to JetBrains if my database was deployed. But anyway, That's one more thing I quickly want to highlight to you before we skip to questions. That is, I'm also, whenever I do an FTP deployment, and I'm going to close a couple of those again. Whenever I do an FTP deployment, I'm actually also running a DB migrate target. That DB migrate target, what it does is it runs the DB deploy task that is inside Phing, and that one actually runs incremental updates on your database as part of this deployment script. So what it does is I have one delta which simply creates my tables and can undo my tables if I want to roll back to a previous version. It will gather all the files from this deltas directory and add them into a massive SQL file that will be deployed to my application server. But the fun thing is, by doing this, I can deploy my database and files, whether that's to a remote file system using FTP, or doing a git commit, or whatever you want to do using Phing. So it's maybe a good topic for a future webinar to explain Phing and how that works and how you can do DB deploy and so on. But I'm not going to go deeper into that one at this time. But if you're interested, do ping me and I will give you some resources on that. So in conclusion, deployments are a different beast for everyone watching this webinar probably. And for PhpStorm, deployments are the deployments you typically want to do as part of your development workflow, mainly transferring files from the local project to a remote server or to a Vagrant box or something, whether that's automatic, manual, or whenever you commit to VCS or whenever you start running your application. Very important thing there is mappings. PhpStorm has to know how the local file system maps to the remote file system. And we've also seen Phing if you want to do more, like all the crazy things like doing database deployments or maybe launching EC2 instances or labeling Git sources and so on whenever you do a deployment. With that, I think we still have a couple of minutes for questions. So Mikhail, I don't know if you have any questions you want to launch.
Yeah, thank you, Maarten. We already have a few questions. So the first one. Just a second. Yeah, the first question is about downloading and external changes. For example, getting notifications that something has been changed on the deployment version of your project. Is there any feature to support that and provide information?
That's a very good question, and actually, yes, there is. So I'm going to quickly demonstrate that one. Switch back to my previous version that I also uploaded to the remote server. So I can show it in there. So let's first check out, yes, sure, I want to reload my project. I'm again going to use my console here to make a change to a file, let's say index.php, just to make sure there's a change to demonstrate this feature. So let's add another comment in there. There we go. And let's go back to our PhpStorm project. If we go to the settings and go to the deployment options, we can say that we want to warn whenever we are uploading over a newer file. By default, this option is disabled. Why is that? Because PhpStorm thinks that the PhpStorm project is the master of the universe and that whatever is on your server should be overwritten. If you want to change that behavior, you have to say that how you want to compare files can either be based on timestamp and file size or on content. So let's in this case select timestamp and size. This will notify me if I am overwriting a file. Now, if I want to be notified whenever I start changing a file in my project, I can also enable this notify checkbox there and basically trigger that notification. So with those two options enabled and clicking OK, if I now open my index.php file and I want to start working in there, this should actually, and it doesn't work because I haven't connected to my remote server yet. Let's try that again. So this actually should, and I say should, give me a notification about the fact that I'm overwriting a file. But maybe this is the case because I didn't actually enable my my server before. So let's do a quick upload of this file to my site again. It's always fun to do demos twice. So let's upload my index.php. Let's change it on the remote server again. So let's add foo there. Let's save. And let's open my index.php file again. I had this working before the webinar. You have to trust me on that. Anyway, the way this should work, and it's probably because I'm working on the EAP version here, the way it should work is it will give you a notification at the top of the file where you can say, I want to merge or simply replace the local file. If you click merge, you will get this div dialog where you again can cherry pick all the changes that were made on the remote side and copy them to your local file, or simply replace the local file with the remote changes. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, and we will answer a couple of other questions, and we have one about continuous integration and how can we actually use our continuous integration server to negotiate with our project, and what should be the best workflow.
Okay, very good question. All these questions are actually the part of the webinar that I wanted to do, but we're out of time. But I guess we still have some 5 minutes to do this. I'm actually making use of TeamCity, which is JetBrains' continuous integration server. And TeamCity is basically a general purpose continuous integration server. So it can build .NET, it can build Java, it can build whatever. You don't have to use TeamCity. Of course, I prefer you do because it's awesome. But if you're using Jenkins or Travis or something like that, you can do similar things like I will be showing. So what I have here, I have a project which deploys to Windows Azure. And that project has a configuration which simply runs Phing. And we've seen in the last part of my demo that I created a Phing file, which was called deploy.xml, and that I had an in-place and an FTP option that I could use to deploy. Well, I can simply run Phing from within my continuous integration server and deploy that way. So if I go back to my projects, if I click run, we will see that my application, in this case, it doesn't do much, it simply runs the deployment. But if you want to add unit testing using PHP unit, for example, you could do that in there as well. But in this case, I simply ran my Phing deployment file, which gave me the update config output, my deploy in place output, and so on. So if you want to use a continuous integration server, I would probably say have it trigger a build or a deployment whenever you have changes in VCS and have them deploy and have those changes deployed to the remote server from within the CI server.
Thank you. It seems that we are running out of time, so probably I'll just email together with Maarten all the answers to questions we still have tomorrow, and the recording of the webinar will be published quite soon, and we will also try to overview all the most important questions we still haven't answered in the blog post announcing the recording, so just stay tuned. And I would like to thank Maarten for this awesome presentation. Thank you, Maarten.
You're welcome.
And I'll just get back screen back to me for a couple of minutes to show you how to get the information if you would like to further explore some PhpStorm features. So here we go, and if you would like to know more about PhpStorm, then just check out all the features at jetbrains.com/phpstorm, and you can provide us any feedback directly to Maarten at maarten.balliauw@jetbrains.com, and check out his Twitter, Maarten Balliauw. And a few days ago, we also published a workshop at GitHub, so you can actually check out the GitHub repository through Composer and get all the tasks right in your IDE and navigate through different features and learn much more about your IDE. And as I said, the video is going to be available in a few days in our JetBrains YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/JetBrainsTV. And of course, stay tuned to our blog and Twitter. We usually have a webinar once a month, so stay tuned to get all the updates about upcoming webinars. Now I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and we will definitely keep in touch with other webinars soon. Thank you. Bye.